Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Kirsten, and together with my sister Lynn, we created the Anti-Racist Table as a way to bring anti-racism into life as a daily practice, and we do this in large part with our free 30-day challenge, which is a long study form anti-racism education. And we invite you to, if you haven't seen it before, to come to our website and check it out. It's free. It's great to do by yourself. It's great to do in groups. And we've heard from lots of people that it's been really transformative for them. So we also host these events like the one we're having tonight, which we're super excited to have Professor Wanamaker talking about a very important topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, who's going to do our land acknowledgement.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I would like to start our time together with a land acknowledgement that is inspired by Ruth King as a way to be mindful of the land that we're occupying. And so I would like to call on my ancestors to stand with me as I acknowledge the native custodians of this land that I occupy, that the colonizers called Washington, D.C. It is the Anacostan land and the Piscataway people's land, those people that are named, unnamed, known, unknown, past and present. We honor all traditions and traditional custodians of this region, and we recognize their continued connection with this land, with this water, and with this community. We pay respect to the earth, whose generous resources sustain us every day. And we pay respect to the enslaved African-American people who were brought, held, and sold here, and all of their descendants, and all of the people throughout the world who live in captivity. We pay respect to their spiritual labor, and we pay respect to our ancestors whose unwise relationship to race and racism we have inherited. We pay respect to our teachers and our elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all the young people today that are teaching us. We honor this gathering, everyone here, and our special guest, Dr. Wanamaker, for taking time to be with us and to share her wisdom. May we all recognize that we share an aspiration to be free in heart, mind, and body. Ashe, here ends our land acknowledgement.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to introduce our guest. Professor Marianne Wanamaker is an associate professor of economics at the University of Tennessee, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics and at the University of Stellenbosch, South Africa. She serves as co-editor of Explorations in Economic History and is the former chief domestic economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, where she also served as the senior labor economist. She is a member of the Federal Workforce Policy Advisory Board. Dr. Wanamaker's research interests include labor economics and workforce development, education, American economic history, and demography. So with that, thank you so much for being here, Professor Wanamaker. I'm going to turn this over to you. We're very excited to hear your presentation. I had the honor of hearing you present, and I thought, yes, the Anti-Racist Table needs to hear this.
Okay, thanks very much for having me. Lynn or Kirsten, could you just give me a thumbs up if you can see? Yeah, okay, good. And you can hear, all right. So thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. As the introduction stated, well, I don't have any wisdom. The introduction stated that I had wisdom, so I don't know about that. But what I do have is a lot of facts. And I've spent my relatively short career in economics, which is about 12 years long. I've spent all of that career basically studying the economic history of Black men in the US economy. It's a whole nother topic about how I got interested in that and how I started that research agenda, but it's been fruitful in the sense that it was much of what I've done, I think, is low-hanging fruit. These are questions and resources and research that probably should have been done a long time ago, and it wasn't. And so it's been very fulfilling and also in some ways very successful to be in this, to look at this research stream, because it's been so, again, sort of relatively unaddressed up until now. So I'm going to share with you a lot of research that's my own, but also research that comes from colleagues of mine, others who work in economics, and in particular in economic history, which is my subfield. So people who work in economic history and the more recent information that's come out about these topics. So the topic of my talk tonight is just 150 years of racial inequality in the US. And so what I really want to do for you is give you as much information as I can about relative income inequality from emancipation through today. And I'm going to do that with a combination of data, but also narrative stories that maybe help put that data in context. That's the goal. So thank you for being here and for entertaining me here. So you might first wonder why are we starting in 1865? Why did we need to wait on emancipation to tell this story? Well, the reason is that economists think about things in terms of income. And of course, before emancipation, there's no income. There's full ownership of individuals, and it's not really a reasonable practice to go back and say, well, what about freed blacks? How did their experience compare to white Americans? It's possible, but maybe not where we really wanted to start. So I'm going to start today in this presentation with really 1870, which is the first census year after emancipation. I'll talk more about the role of the US Census in building these data sets. And at that time, as emancipation is happening, what that means is that 89% of Black Americans who had been enslaved in 1863 and 1864 were by the end of 1865, of course, not enslaved anymore. So it's a massive population of people, but again, it's also a population that was almost 90% enslaved just a few months prior. I'm also really going to be focusing my comments today on men. And the reason is twofold. One is that for women, certainly in the past, their work and their income is largely invisible to us. We can't really tell what they're doing and how they're faring in the labor market. Also, some of the methods that I'm going to show you here, the most recent methods, involve linking sons when they're young to themselves as they grow older. So we look and see what are the patterns of kind of intergenerational income. And so women, when they change their name, when they get married, they make it really hard to find them. So genealogists on this call know what I mean. It's hard to find a woman if she changes her name, right? And so we're usually working forward in time, and it makes it really challenging. So most of what I'm going to tell you today is again about Black men. Okay, so again, this history is really going to start with emancipation in 1864, 1865. Now, some of us had a really poor American economic history education as a child. I know I certainly did, but we do know, I think, most of us, that although emancipation brought freedom, so to speak, it was no panacea. And in the end, the day-to-day working conditions for Black Americans, especially in the South, didn't necessarily change all that much in 1865. And that emancipation brought with it this new question, which was, well, now what are we going to do, right? I mean, the set of resources and the human capital and the training, the skills that these people had as they're emancipated really still relegated them to a career in agriculture. There wasn't much else to do other than that. And the forms of that work weren't all that liberating. So the stories of sharecropping and tenancy. And so that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about again today. So one thing we can do, though, is we can take information from 1870 and we can say, all right, if we think about that as the beginning, what can we say about the ratio or the relationship of income for Black Americans relative to income for white Americans? And I'm going to argue over the course of this presentation that that's really the thing we should care, as a first approximation, that's the thing we should really care the most about. How does income for Black Americans compare to income for white Americans? And if the answer to that is, well, it's 1 to 1, I think we would be in a very different position as a country. I think we could probably agree on that. So I think it's a relevant metric, and it's one that we're able to track all the way back to 1870. And so the scholars who have worked on this have looked at it and said, well, if we do this in 1870, our best estimate is that it's about 25 cents on the dollar. Okay, so in other words, for every dollar that a white American made in 1870, a Black American was making about 25 cents. And so tonight's presentation is going to round out this picture and going to take us all the way up through today, thinking about how this income ratio has changed over time. Now, again, some of you had a better American history education than I did. I needed this timeline when I started this work 12 years ago. I don't need it anymore, but you might still. And that timeline is that the immediate post-war, post-Civil War era is commonly referred to as Reconstruction, the period in which the South was under the sort of control of the North, and then it wasn't. And then as the South emerges out of Reconstruction towards 1880, 1890, we move into what's commonly referred to as Jim Crow. It's the era between when Reconstruction ends and when we get the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act in 1965. Of course, in the meantime, we have 2 major world wars. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The Civil Rights era itself roughly spans the 1960s. And then there's the modern era. And I'm not going to have a ton to say about the modern era, but I am going to go ahead and fill out the figure I just showed you. I'm going to bring it up all the way to the present day. Okay, so I want to start with a fact that I didn't know when I started working in this area, which is that at the end of the Civil War, that famous 40 acres and a mule actually was U.S. policy for a very brief amount of time. And majority of the time when I talk about this to a live audience where we're sharing the same room, I can see their faces say, what? And truly it is the case. So General Sherman, I'm a Southerner, so the really despised General Sherman, when he finishes his march to the sea and he lands in Savannah in January of 1865, he arrives with trailing him is a kind of sub-army of freed slaves. And as the Union Army made its way through the South and they declared that that this is now Union territory, slaves realized, well, we're not slaves anymore. It's over, right? If the Union is winning, then we're not slaves. And so they followed the army as a form of protection. Because they knew that Sherman was committed to the ideal of free Americans and freeing the slaves. And so they followed him all the way to the coast in January. And so he consults with a group of ministers, Black and white ministers, and he says, what am I supposed to do with all these thousands of people that are trailing me? It's going to become a humanitarian disaster if I don't do something, because it's wintertime, I don't have food, I don't have any way of sheltering people. And so they came up with this idea of 40 acres and a mule. The mule never actually happened, but the 40 acres did. And so what Sherman did was he issued what's referred to as Special Field Order number 15. And he said, the land that has been seized by the Union, seized from Southerners by the Union is now available to be parceled out to these freed slaves. Okay, so we're going to have this 40 acres policy, and we're going to take these about 850,000 acres is what he had on hand to hand out. And he starts handing out the 850,000 acres. And so most of that land is in coastal South Carolina. And by June of 1865, the Union had distributed 400,000 acres to about 40,000 former slaves. Now, it's worth noting at this juncture that 4 million slaves were emancipated. Okay, so as great as Sherman's idea was, it wasn't destined for success without some further action on the part of the federal government. More land would have had to have been seized. There would have had to have been some greater amount of redistribution than what Sherman had his hands on at the time. When Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th of that same year, that effectively ended the land redistribution policy. And in August, President Andrew Johnson orders that Southern whites who pledge their allegiance to the Union and pay their taxes can be returned to their previous land. And that includes all of this land that had been distributed to former slaves. And so most of what had been distributed was eventually returned to its original owner. The federal government took another tact as well to try to get land to Southern Blacks. So there was some land in the South that they were going to parcel out to former slaves in a sort of a homesteading sense. So you probably learned in your history classes about the Homestead Act that brought whites from the eastern seaboard all the way west. They moved to South Dakota, North Dakota, Oklahoma, right? And so that was one homesteading act. But there was another homesteading act that was specifically for the South. Again, it was open to former slaves. It ultimately was not all that successful. It ended in 1876, and there were only about 4,500 Black farms established during that period. One of the most remarkable pieces of archival material, to me anyway, is this letter from a former slave who was on Edisto Island in South Carolina. He's writing to President Johnson in October after it's become clear that Johnson intends to take the land that this gentleman was living on and give it back to its previous owner. And so he writes to the president and he says, "Shall not we who are freedmen and have been always true to this union have the same rights as enjoyed by others? Have we broken any law of these United States? Have we forfeited our rights of property and land? If not, then are not our rights as a free people and good citizens of these United States to be considered before the rights of those who were found in rebellion against this good and just government?" And then he goes on to say, "Land monopoly is injurious to the advancement of the course of freedom. And if government does not make some provision by which we as freedmen can obtain a homestead, we have not bettered our condition." I can't overemphasize for you just how important land ownership was to freed slaves. This was the most important thing. Later, when we talk about the Civil Rights Act, I will say that during the Civil Rights period, the most important thing to Black Americans was employment. It was economic opportunity. And the language of that in 1865 was a job. The language of opportunity, in 1965 was a job. The language of opportunity in 1865 was land. And I think we sometimes forget that when we think about the history of the South. This really was the primary goal. Now, I want to say that, to kind of understand the Reconstruction period, you have to sort of hold two ideas in tension, right? One is the story I just told you about broken promises of redistribution, the lack of any plan to really get land in the hands of formerly enslaved Southerners. There wasn't, of course, no systematic plan to do that and no successful strategy for making it happen. At the same time, if you look at the years from 1865 until 1890 or 1900 or so, you will be surprised at just how much economic progress does happen in the South for Black Americans. So first, I'll say home ownership and land ownership rises substantially. I'm going to show you some information about that in a minute. Political participation and political empowerment really rise in this period. The Freedmen's Bureau makes some advance in Southern education. And there's new evidence that suggests that patenting activity, so inventive activity among Black Americans in the South, really surges through 1900. So although there's no formal way or no formal mechanism by which formerly enslaved Southerners are again compensated for their slavery, there is still a ton of progress being made. So let me give you the details. So this is an old paper, oldish paper anyway, from 2011. And it's looking at the rate of home ownership for Black and white Americans from 1870 all the way through 2007, trying to do the same thing I'm going to do for income. They're doing it for home ownership. And so one thing you'll notice is that the gap in home ownership declines from 49 percentage points in 1870 to 26 percentage points in 1900. So Black Southerners really move into home ownership in this period. They double their home ownership rate in about 20 or 30 years. At the same time that white Americans are moving out of home ownership. As they urbanize, for example, they're less likely to own their own home. Another thing you might notice about this figure is that the entirety of the convergence between Black and white home ownership rates happened between 1870 and 1900, and there's been effectively no change since then, right? The last number on this figure shows a 23 percentage point gap. Another short-term victory for Reconstruction efforts was the political franchise. The economic history literature has a nice new paper on the successes of local Black politicians in the Reconstruction period. And indeed, there have been 11 Black Americans elected to the US Senate in our history. 2 of them were from Mississippi in the 1870s and early 1880s. And those 2 gentlemen are on the left and right of Douglas here in this picture. So Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce were these gentlemen's names. After Revels and Bruce, it would be another 100 years, almost 100 years, before there was another Black American elected to the Senate, and that was Edward Brooke in 1967. Now, a fun game is to see whether you can name the other 8. Okay, so I just told you 3. See if you can name the other 8, and a hint is that one of them was just elected in January. Okay, so that's a gimme. All right, now you got 7 left. All right. Now, Lisa Cook, who some of you may have heard of or know about, she's perhaps the most famous Black economist in the country right now. At Michigan State, she's being considered for a position on the Federal Reserve Board, which would be amazing. She has some work looking at patenting activity, so she's interested in economic growth and innovation. And so what I'm showing you is the results from some of her work. And so what I want to draw your attention to here is just how rapidly Black patenting activity rises from roughly 1870 to 1900. Okay, now the scale of Black and white patenting is very different. Okay, so be careful about interpreting these axes. They are very different in scale, but the pattern is that while white patenting was more or less flat, right, from looking from 1870 to 1900, it doesn't change all that much. You can see that Black patenting is really accelerating in this period. Lisa's story in this book, or in this paper, unfortunately, is that the rise of lynching, which really takes hold about 1900, it puts an end to patenting activity. It ends the incentives for invention among Black Americans, and that is the source of that sharp fall off in 1900 and that relatively low amount of patenting thereafter. Okay, so that, again, intention, lots of things we could have done better, some clear successes. But Reconstruction, the period that surrounded, or the period that held those successes was short-lived when the funding for Reconstruction ends in 1870, troops withdraw by 1877, and things really turn sour by 1900. So I've already mentioned violence through lynchings, but there's so much more. Voting restrictions through poll taxes and literacy tests, school and societal segregation, Black codes, which brought in occupational segregation, penal labor, which incentivized Southern municipalities to imprison the Black population. You can kind of go on and on. I say it really turned sour by 1900. That's when it really gets bad. But all of this is spurred by the end of Reconstruction in 1877. So W.E.B. Du Bois really kind of sums up this period of American history by saying that the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. Now, in terms of my income ratio graph, you can see that by 1900, the income ratios in the US are at roughly 30 or 35%. So that is progress. It's not quick, swift progress, but it is some progress in closing the gap in income. All right, so that's going to bring us then to the Jim Crow period. And this is where most of my work has been. I've done a lot of work in public education, and the picture I'm showing you here is from the National Archives, the picture of a Southern school in 1920. The cursive at the top of the picture is written on it before it was sent to the National Archive, describing this as a quote unquote colored school. And in my research, I'm looking at how the segregated and dilapidated Black schools in the South affected the labor market outcomes of individuals who were schooled in those places. So as you know, again, I'm guessing your American history didn't fail you on this point. As you know, in 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision mandated an equal provision of public schools across races. And that's that famous separate but equal requirement. The facts on the ground, however, indicate that classroom experiences were nowhere near equal from at least 1910 onward. My colleague, Celeste Carruthers here at the University of Tennessee, and I used self-reported education statistics from the southern states. They sent these manuals of statistics to the federal government, revealing in clear sight of anybody who wanted to open the cover of the book that there was nothing separate or equal about what was going on in the South. And they sent these statistics to the federal government every single year. And so we grabbed all of those old books and had them shipped to Knoxville, and we transcribed all of the information that was in it to help us understand how different were these schools and how much did it matter. So here's an example. This is from North Carolina in 1919 and 1920. This is Alamance County, and then every township within Alamance County. So it's very detailed information. And it can tell you things like enrollment or how many teachers there were. On average, how many students showed up every day? How much did you pay those teachers? On other pages of this manual, it would say, how much did you spend on the average white school? How much did you spend on the average quote unquote colored school? And so from that information, we can get really detailed statistics on the education quality of students in the South from 1910 to 1940. This figure shows you the outcome of that exercise. All right, so from 1910 to 1940, it gives you per capita spending in white schools and per capita spending in Black schools. Now, when I say per capita, I mean per eligible student. Okay, so think about it as per 6 through 16-year-olds. How much money are you spending? Now, the ratio of white to Black spending was already stark in 1910, right? You can just eyeball it and see that there's multiples here, the spending on white schools relative to spending on Black schools. But it's relatively flat through 1920. The vertical line here is the line for 1920, and it comes from a paper that Celeste and I wrote about, unfortunately, how the 19th Amendment affected this. So if you know your gender economics, you probably know that women prefer to spend money on things like schools, hospitals, what we call public goods. Men do not prefer to spend money on these things. And so when women are enfranchised through the 19th Amendment in 1920, the spending patterns in this country really diverged from their history. Okay, so you can see that here, especially when you look at the white schools line, right? All of a sudden, we're spending a ton more money on schools, and you can attribute that to women. What you probably guessed, and you would be right if you did, is that in the South, of course, that franchise extends only to white women, and white women only care to spend money on white schools. And so the change in spending on Black schools is much less stark, and you can see that on the bottom. So we started at a 3-to-1 gap in 1910. By 1940, the spending gap was 5-to-1. Okay, so we really blew things up. Now, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote last year, and it'll always have an asterisk by it for me for this reason. So Celeste and I took this information and we've done a lot of things with it, but one of the things we've done with it is we've fast forwarded and we've said, okay, let's go to 1940. Let's pull individuals out of the census in 1940. Let's see how much money they're making. And then let's compare that to the quality of the schools that they would have gone to when they were in school, given what we know about their residency patterns. Okay. And so what we learned was that the actual rate of income, relative income for this group of individuals in 1940 was 47 or 48%. In other words, Black men are earning 48 cents where white men earn $1. Okay, that's what we observe in actuality in the 1940 census. And then we run this simulation where we say, okay, but what if everybody had been to an equally funded school? Then what would have happened? And that's the blue bars. So what we can show is that depending on how you think about it, the gap would have closed to something like 68 to 74%. So separate and unequal schools were really a tragic part of the story of income inequality through 1940 for sure. All right, now I'm going to take a slight detour and talk. I put something else new on my timeline here. I'm going to take a slight detour and talk about the Great Migration. So again, this is where my own American history failed me completely. I didn't know what the Great Migration was when I got to college, and I feel like I probably should have. So let me share a little bit about what we know about that. So by 1950, just over 60% of Black Americans lived in the South. That's down from 95% 50 years prior. This massive movement of Southern Blacks to the North has fascinated economists for years. And you can see here the paths or the patterns that represent the migration itself. So my family is from Mississippi. My own white ancestors took this Mississippi to Chicago route, okay? And there was a migration of whites in this period as well. It was just nowhere near as large as the migration of Black Southerners. Now, if you've read Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which I hope many of you have, it's one of my favorites. I think what you'll notice about that book is she's actually following one individual in each one of these paths, right? And that didn't sink into me until years after I'd read that book. And then I thought, wait a minute, she's really following blue, purple, and yellow here, right? And so what's the story about the Great Migration? Isabel doesn't get into that. She doesn't need to. She's telling a great story about these three individuals. Really what's commonly thought about the Great Migration is that this is a response to poor treatment in the South. That conditions had gotten so bad that at some point we've had enough. We're moving out of here. We're going to greener pastures, so to speak. If you look at the economic history evidence on that, it's pretty weak. And what really we think is happening here is that in 1917 and 1918, as World War I is happening, the U.S. shuts down immigration. And there are a ton of industrial manufacturing locations in the North that now cannot get cheap labor. They had been importing cheap labor from abroad. The government ended that, and now they're desperate. And so they go south and they recruit. And once they can recruit some individuals north, then others will follow. And so this chain migration pattern ultimately populates the cities that you see on this map, and it populates the industrial manufacturers in the north. Now, I have built a career trying to understand how things like the Great Migration mattered for income using a common genealogy tool called Ancestry.com. So many of you on this call have probably used this for your own family genealogy. And so what we do as economists or economic historians is we do this on a mass scale. So you're curious to know where your grandmother was, in 1930, and then where was she in 1940, and then where was she in 1950. And so I'm interested in knowing where was every American in 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, 1950. And so we build these data sets that contain millions of individuals where we can observe where they are at different points in time, right? And so that means that I spend a lot of time working with data that looks like this. So I just want to, this is my pitch for credibility here. Okay, this is not fun working with this, but this is what we do. All right, and then so why would we want to trace people over time? Well, one of the big questions about the Great Migration is, hey, how much did it matter? Did moving north ultimately raise people's incomes? Was it an economic story, or was it just a way of life story? Which one of these things is more true? And so what we do is we say, well, let's take two brothers. All right, they're both living in the same county in Mississippi in 1910. And then 20 years later, one of them lives in Chicago and one of them still lives in Mississippi. And we say, how different are their incomes? And the idea is that had the brother not moved to Chicago, their incomes might have been pretty similar, right? And so then you can use techniques like that to think about the counterfactual of, well, what would have happened if they stayed? What happened when they left? And what's the difference? And so when you do that, what you see is that the income returns to moving north in the Great Migration were massive. Something on the order of 60% increases in incomes just by leaving the South and moving to the North. And that includes cost of living adjustments. So after you've taken out the cost of living adjustment, you still get a 60% increase in income. So in part because of the Great Migration, you can see income convergence continues from the last data points I showed you in 1900 all the way through 1960. The data are getting better and more frequent, so we're able to make these ratios every single year, starting in about 1950. And so you can see that on the eve of the civil rights movement, we're looking at an income ratio of something like 45 to 48%. So will the civil rights era really change this trajectory? Now, the nice thing about moving into the 1960s is that we just have a lot more data. There's a lot more interesting stuff to work with. So what I'm showing you here is a 1963 survey of Black Americans, and it shows that employment opportunities, as I mentioned before, are far and away the most important issue on people's minds. It gets 4 times the number of votes or the number of yeses here as the voting rights gets. Okay, so the question again is, which do you think is most important to work for now? And the answer here is jobs. This movement is primarily about employment. So as I said before, land was the battle of Reconstruction and jobs were the battle of the Civil Rights era. Now, many of you will know all the components of Civil Rights era legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It has some voting rights provisions in it. It desegregates public and private facilities, desegregates public schools, and it establishes the equal employment opportunity, which in 1972 is followed up by the actual EEOC. There's a separate Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1966. And so for many of us probably have the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 memorized, right? It's unlawful employment practice for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge anyone with respect to compensation terms, conditions, etc., on the basis of an individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, right? So we know these things. We see them when we apply for a job, right? These are common. They become really kind of part of our common understanding of what it means to comply with Civil Rights Act. So let me give you an example of how much the Civil Rights Act matters. So this is an example from an older paper, but they're looking at the Southern textile industry. So I'm from Eastern Tennessee, which is really close to North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, which is the epicenter of the textile industry. And it was perhaps the most segregated industry in the country in the 1960s. And you can see it here, okay, the share of employees in the textile industry that are white males, black males, white females, and black females. You can see that the number of black males isn't zero. Okay, the number of black females is zero prior to 1965. The number of black males is not zero, but it's not zero because these textile mills did hire black men, but they hired them to be outdoor groundskeepers. That could be their job, but they were not allowed to have any other job in the mill. And so in 1964, I mean, to me, it's almost even surprising that these numbers moved at all. If you know Southerners, you know they're ungovernable and really difficult to get along with. But even in the South, even in the textile industry where segregation was the highest, the Civil Rights Act mattered. And you can see those numbers moving. By 1966, things are changing and Black employment is rising in the textile industry. Another important piece of legislation here is the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so I just want to give a quick kind of a shout out here. So the Social Security Act of 1935 and previous legislation on the minimum wage had both been very careful in the way that that legislation was constructed. It excluded Black Americans, not by excluding Black Americans, but by excluding industries where Black Americans were predominantly employed. So the Social Security Act, the original Social Security Act, and the original minimum wage legislation in the US both excluded agriculture and they excluded domestic service, which is where the vast majority of Black workers were. So this figure is about minimum wage. And what it's showing you is that in 1938, in Black here, the minimum wage is $4 for workers who are in manufacturing, transportation, communication, wholesale, et cetera. It's $0 for workers who are employed in restaurants, public schools, hospitals, nursing homes, et cetera, and agriculture. What the Fair Labor Standards Act does in 1967 is it moves all of those excluded industries into the national minimum wage legislation. It rolls it out slowly over the next few years, but effectively now by kind of 1975 or so, all industries are covered by minimum wage. Right? And so you get rid of this sort of segregation and exclusion by industry that you had up until then. Okay, so where did all that Civil Rights era progress leave us? Okay, where are we on my graph from before? Well, good news, there's good news and bad news, I guess. The good news is that the Civil Rights Act does accelerate convergence. Okay, that's this period right here. So if you can see my cursor, if you look at this, we're above the line. Okay, meaning that we're running ahead of the income convergence that we'd been experiencing up through 1960. This slow, steady pace was starting to really change, and we're starting to get this acceleration. And then by the late 1970s and early 1980s, it tails off. And we go back to the same trajectory we were on before. So when people ask me, gosh, did the Civil Rights Act matter? I say, kind of. It kind of mattered in the short run. In the long run, it didn't. I mean, in the long run, we're sort of back to this path that we were on before. And then, of course, you can see that by 2000, this thing has flattened entirely. And there's been effectively no convergence in the racial income gap from 2000 through the last year of data that I have, which is 2019. Okay, we're flat. That, I think it's clear that that was maybe true one other time in US history, which is right here at the end of the 1970s as we're coming out of the Civil Rights Act. We kind of plateau and then go back to our previous growth pattern. Here, there's been no acceleration, and yet we've bottomed out. We've kind of we're leveling out here in terms of income convergence. So that's the pessimistic view. Okay, and you can see that in polling data. So this is I'm not huge on polling data, but I think this is kind of an important observation. So if you look at a Gallup poll from 2019, the nice thing about Gallup is they ask the same questions in the same form forever. They never change the wording. So the wording of this question is going to seem weird to you, but it's because they first started asking it in the 1960s. As I said, in general, do you think that Black people have as good a chance as white people in your community to get any kind of job for which they are qualified? Or don't you think they have as good a chance? Okay, and so if you say yes, all right, then the share of respondents who say yes is what's plotted on this figure. And so what you can see is, prior to the Civil Rights era, the share of Blacks who thought the answer to that question was yes was 24%. It rose steadily over time. It reaches a peak of about 49%, right as the last economic crisis is hitting us, and now we're back down to 30. And that same general pattern actually characterizes white responses as well, right? There's this, low 46-ish% of Americans who think that statement is true. And then it rises over time. It peaks roughly in 2009. And again, it's on the decline. Okay, so this matches what we're seeing in the data, right? That the economic opportunity doesn't appear to be as strong now as it was maybe even a few years ago. Okay, I want to wrap up by just asking or just showing you some of my more recent work. And that work really takes on the question of, is this really a story about race? Or is this about something else, like maybe class? People like that question. Is this about race or is it about class? And so to answer that question, this is what, or the way I'm thinking about it. Here's your thought experiment. So suppose at the end of the Civil War, there was a group of impoverished Americans with low human capital, okay, had not been schooled, were forbidden from learning to read. They were located in rural America or the rural South. They were illiterate, they had illiterate parents, and they were provided little in the way of public education. And suppose those individuals were white. All right, now the question is, would it have taken 150 years for the descendants of that group of individuals to reach an average income of 65% of the national average for whites, which is where Black Americans stand in roughly 2000 to 2019 at 65%. Okay, so this is the question, maybe this is class. Maybe if you took a group of white people who had these characteristics in 1865, it would have taken them also 130 years or 150 years to get to 65%. Okay, so how am I going to answer that question? Well, you may already know the answer. Okay, so you might have been like, the answer is no, and it is no, but let me show you how we're going to get there. Okay, so I want to think about the experiences of Black and white sons who have similarly situated fathers. Okay, so it's kind of like my story earlier about two brothers and one moves to Chicago and one doesn't. I'm going to kind of take that same framework, I'm going to apply it to Black and white families, and I'm going to say, let me take a Black and white family that looks very similar to each other on paper. Okay, they're poor, they live in the South, they don't have anything, they don't own anything, and they're not literate. And let me see how their sons do. And if this is a story about class, then the sons of the Black father and the white father will kind of look the same because they came from the same class. And if it's not about class, then they're going to look different. Okay, so that's the idea. So I'm going to hold class fixed, and then I'm going to let race vary. Okay, and then now the question is, does race still matter once we've kind of fixed everybody to the same starting economic position? To do that, we're going to build a bunch of new data sets using those old census manuscripts that I showed you before. I'm going to start in 1880, in part because the 1870 census is pretty crappy. So we're going to start in 1880, and then we're going to have these fathers, and then we're going to follow their sons and kind of see how they do over time. And we don't have to work so hard when we get to about 1950 because the federal government does this for us. It has data sets that have fathers and sons in them where you can see the father when the son is younger, and then you can see the son as he grows up and he's older. Okay, so bear with me for just a second. Okay, let me tell you what's in this figure. Black dots represent Black households. Red dots represent white households. Okay, I am taking the fathers here and I'm lining them up from 0 to 100 on the national income distribution. So if you're super poor, you're down here. If you're richer than everybody, if you're Bill Gates, you're right here. Okay, and the dots are telling you what's the average outcome for sons of fathers who are at that point in the income distribution. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 dots here that correspond to the 1st through the 10th percentile. There are 10 more dots that correspond to the 11th through the 20th percentile, okay? And then every one of these dots tells you the average income for their sons, where again, the sons are ranked in the national income distribution. Bill Gates is here, and the super poor individuals are here. And so what you can see is that just take a given percentile for fathers, so the 20th percentile for fathers, and that you can think about that roughly as being poverty. Anybody below that, I mean, everybody in 1880 is doing pretty poorly in the South, but think about if you're below the 20th percentile, you're really not doing well. There are a lot of Black fathers are down here. There aren't any Black fathers out here. I don't know who this guy is. I should go back and figure it out. But anyway, so then you can compare the white sons of really poor fathers to the Black sons of really poor fathers. And you can see immediately from this exercise that these are not the same experiences. This experience of having a poor Black father leaves you with your own income in roughly the 15th percentile or 10th to 15th percentile of the national income distribution. So you yourself are still poor. But if you're white and your father was poor, on average, you're not poor. You're up here at the 30, 40, 50, maybe even the 60th percentile of the national income distribution. You're better than average if you're above the 50th percentile, okay? So there's just no evidence that these experiences are the same. And likewise, there's no evidence that this is a story about class. You can do this again for 1910 fathers and their 1930 sons. You get the exact same story, right? Especially at the bottom of this income distribution. You know, if you're the son of a Black father who's down here, you're doing worse. You're worse off than the son of a white father who's down here. And now we can fast forward through time. So now I can say, all right, what about fathers that the federal government observes in 1950 and their sons they observe in 1962? It's pretty much the same. Now there's some parts, look over here, there's some parts where their experiences are more similar, okay, but it's not down here. There's nothing about being the son of a poor Black father that's similar to being the son of a poor white father in the 1950s and 1960s. It's also not true in the 1960s and the 1970s. There's no evidence that that changes with civil rights. And it's not true 1979 through 2000. We have data all the way through 2010. I don't think I have it in this presentation. Same thing. So again, there's some convergence up here. If you're middle class, if you're the son of a middle class Black father and a middle class white father, your experiences are much more similar. But it's not the case down here, right? These are two very different sets of outcomes. All right, so what do we conclude from that little exercise? What we conclude is that the children of low status or poor whites have had far higher incomes than those of similarly situated Black Americans throughout US history. Moreover, we show in the work that we do on this that this difference in how fathers do or don't affect the outcomes of their sons, that is the predominant primary driver of income inequality today. In other words, if the sons of poor Black fathers experience life the way the sons of poor white fathers do in the United States, income convergence would happen. But it can't happen as long as those two groups have very different economic experiences. Okay, I want to close with just a little bit of recommended reading. That Raphael Bostic, anything that man writes, you should read. But he has a piece called "A Moral and Economic Imperative to End Racism" and he's the president and I think he's just called the president of the Atlanta Fed. He's a banker, he's an economist, he's a Black man. He's a Black gay man. If you told me 20 years ago that the president of the Atlanta Fed be a Black gay man, I would have told you were insane. So things have changed, and this is great that he is where he is, and he's really eloquent. He has this really nice piece about why racism has to go if we're going to have the best economy we can have. And so it's a really great piece. I really recommend it to you. I also recommend to you Jim Tankersley's book, The Riches of This Land. If you haven't read it, it's a good one, thinking about, why do we think about the economy as a zero-sum game, that if you have it, I can't have it. And he argues in this book that that's relatively new thinking. We didn't think like that after World War II. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, I've already recommended. And then one of my personal favorites, this is Zora Neale Hurston's book called Barracoon. And it's the story, as she calls it, of the last Black cargo. And this is a book about a gentleman who was brought to the United States in the illegal slave trade right before Emancipation. So if you thought the slave trade ended in 1809, I think you're wrong. It didn't. And so this is a story of him and how he gets to the US, what happens to him after Emancipation. It's just an incredible book. So that's my recommended reading list. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I think one or both of the hosts here are going to curate some questions. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That was such important information. Let's see the questions. If anyone has a question, you can put it in the chat or in the Q&A. And right now there's one question. Is there a resource that explains why the Jim Crow period was named this?
I think, okay, gosh, my brain is scrambled because it's really late at night here, but I think that it's called that because Jim Crow was a character in a minstrel show, which was, somebody maybe know more about this than I do, and you can correct me, but I think that's the source of the name, is that there used to be these shows, they call them minstrel shows. They were these shows that were like characterizing Black Americans as everything negative you can think of, and they would put people on stage and they would perhaps be in blackface as they did it, and he was a popular character. I think that's the source of that name, but gosh, Wikipedia knows better than I do probably, but I believe that's where that came from.
Yeah, that's my recollection too.
But again, I didn't learn that in school, so
Yes. Probably most of us didn't. Yeah, anybody else have questions? If there's no other questions coming from the audience, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Dr. Wanamaker, thanks for that. What are your feelings on reparations?
Okay, so I actually have another paper. We're working on the reparations question by trying to sort out, like, if those figures I showed you about the sons of Black Americans in 1880, the fathers are in 1880, the sons are in 1900. So we're redoing that work where instead of thinking about the income of fathers, we're thinking about their land ownership. So we're trying to understand, like, suppose you had just given people 40 acres, what would have happened? Okay, and so the early evidence indicates that if you gave them 40 acres, that wouldn't have done anything. That in and of itself wasn't going to address all of the other issues that were going on in the South at that time. And so, the message of that paper, although it's still half-baked, but the message of that paper, I think, is, if 40 acres was an outcome that was part and parcel of a bigger, broader program to really hold the South in check and limit discrimination on all the different fronts, great. But if it was just going to be, yeah, we'll give you people some land and now we're going to discriminate in all the other ways, it wasn't going to go anywhere. And so the same thing is true about reparations, right? That reparations as a one-off event where you write someone a check isn't going to change anything. Reparations as an event where you change the structure of the economy and in the way people treat each other and the way people behave, if that's part of the process, then you're going to be more successful.
Yeah, we agree with that. We definitely agree in a robust, kind of pronged reparations that does include some checks, but also some supports, community support, funding schools, funding other resources. What other resources would you think would be valuable?
Well, there's that.
Out?
I'll also say that there's new research that suggests that even if you equalized wealth in this country today, by tomorrow it would be unequal again. And the reason is that it goes both ways, meaning that white Americans spend their money or invest their money in more privileged ways. They're also bigger, they're more tolerant of risk. And so you give white Americans money, they invest it in high risk assets, which sometimes pay off 20%, sometimes pay off 0%, but on average do pretty well. And if you get in typically speaking, again, on average, if you give Black Americans money to invest, they're more careful with it and they don't take big risks. And so by tomorrow, we'd have wealth inequality again. And so grappling with that, I think, is important. And what's the solution to that? Well, part of that behavior is ingrained. It's what you learn from your parents. It's what you learn from your grandparents. It's how they treated money. It's how they did or didn't trust financial institutions. It's how they did or didn't think that you should invest in risky assets. So there are, I hate to use the word cultural, but there are kind of cultural ways of dealing with money that as a result of 150 years of inequality, we are where we are. So, it really would have to be you have to think about a very holistic way of dealing with issues like this. My personal preferences would be that yes, you can think about spending money on adults. To me, the low-hanging fruit is you spend money on kids. The fact that we don't have universal preschool in this country is crazy to me. In Tennessee, we definitely don't. So you have 3 and 4-year-olds who aren't in school. And by the time they show up in kindergarten, by many studies, it's too late. And so although I think there's been a lot of positive push recently in terms of making college free and more affordable, and while I think that's important, and while I think reparations is, again, a conversation we need to have, I think if we're spending money, let's talk about spending money so that when kids get to kindergarten, you can't already tell what's going to happen to them. That to me is the most important thing.
Yeah, education.
So we have a few other questions in the chat. Let's see. Have you looked at income change for more than one generation of men, white versus Black?
People have been successful at generating the grandchild to grandfather link. I have not been very successful doing that. What people have also learned from that is that most of the grandfather's qualities get embodied in the son. And so as long as you have the son, you have the father in the grandfather to grandson link, it's good as having the grandfather, if that makes any sense. But yes, you can do it. You can do it. And the 1950 census has been under lock and key, in the US census manuscripts are under lock and key for 72 years. So anyway, the 1950 census becomes available in January 1st, 2022. So economic historians are going to bed early on New Year's Eve, and I'm serious. And we can't wait for that thing to be released.
Treasure chest you've been waiting for to open up.
Waiting for 10 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
Great. Okay, we've got another one. Can you speak to the color of law and redlining and what could be undone towards reparations?
The person who asked that question might want to give me a few more nuggets to latch onto. I don't know exactly what.
Yeah, I think they're talking about redlining, the housing policies that discriminated against Black people. But
maybe the white affirmative action that was happening at the same time.
If Karen wants to add something to her question, let me see. Housing inequality. Yeah.
Well, let me say a couple things about that. So one is that, we have all, I think at this point, been conditioned to think that redlining was like the original sin in housing inequality, that the government did this thing and they drew these maps and then people behaved accordingly, and now we have segregation. And that's not true. Okay, it's not anywhere near true. What happened was that the private market private individuals, realtors, home buyers, homeowners generated the segregation by discriminating. And the federal government stepped in and drew the lines where the segregation already was. Okay, now I'm not suggesting that the federal government shouldn't be held to account for drawing the lines. I just want to point out that they drew the lines where the neighborhoods had already been developed and where those restrictive covenants had already been put in place. So redlining was a confirmation of what people were already doing to each other and not the original sin. And so that, you know, I think that does maybe put that in a little bit of a different perspective. And what I mean by that is that, you know, the problem in discrimination is always people. We're terrible. We really are. And so housing inequality emerged because people are terrible to each other. They don't want to live next to somebody who doesn't look like them, and they're fearful for their housing values or whatever else, right? All the worst characteristics of humans manifest themselves in housing inequality and segregation. And so, you know, how do you fix inequality and segregation? I mean, the government has a role to play, and I'm not suggesting that there's, you know, that we shouldn't have strict rules about mortgage writing and about, you know, home selling and all of that. But the bottom line is that we individuals, right, still prefer to live near people who look like them. It's still true. And so the solution to that problem is us. It's us. It's that we have to be willing to move to neighborhoods where not everyone looks like us, or accept neighbors who don't look like us, or send our kids to schools where the other kids don't look like them. You know, it's us that has to do the mixing. The government can't do it for us. And I know that's kind of a cerebral, esoteric answer to your question, but I really think that's very true.
Well, I guess there's an aspect of, you know, property values. There's, you know, information showing Black people paying higher property taxes, but their property being valued lower. You know, I think there are some other issues around housing that really gets to the wealth gap rather than, you know, say white flight, and studies that show that white people don't want to live in a neighborhood that has more than X percentage of Black people in it, or minorities, which, you know, right, the government's not going to be able to dictate where people live.
Agreed. And I will say that my Black friends they'd say, well, we don't want to live in your neighborhood anyway. So, so this is, you know, it's not necessarily the case that integrated neighborhoods are the ideal outcome, right? Or that fully integrated neighborhoods are the ideal outcome, I guess is the way I would say that. That there's some level of segregation which we shouldn't worry about. The segregation we should worry about is the segregation that comes from unequal opportunity. And so your point about, you know, different property values and that sort of thing absolutely is a role for you know, policymakers and for the government to play. Agreed.
Right, and I think also just funding those communities of color that are defunded right now, giving them, like you were saying, you know, they were spending all this money on the white schools and the white communities, but there was no funding going to the Black communities. That's exactly what's happening now. So the Black communities, they don't necessarily want to move into white communities, but they need to have the services that white communities have.
There was an elementary school a mile from my house, which 4 years ago, there was a thing on the evening news about how they were raising money for a playground. And I was like, oh, you know, they must be replacing their playground. No, they didn't have a playground. They had never had a playground. It was an elementary school with no playground. And I'm still just like stunned. Like, how is that possible? You know, like what confluence of events results in 2016, a school in urban Knoxville has no playground for kindergartners? It's just stunning to me.
Well, it just shows how invisible racism is, and how
a
lot of people are just going around thinking that everything is equal when it's clearly not. Yeah, so it's important to be aware of what's happening in your own community and the people that live in different neighborhoods that are really your neighbors, and, you know, do something to help raise awareness to those inequalities and push for change on that local level.
Can I ask you how, the part of your presentation where you talk about 1920 and the, the increase in funding in white schools driven by white women, how do people receive that information? Because I think that, there's a narrative in this country that people cling to, and it's not really about making people feel bad, but it's about really people, taking responsibility and recognizing when they have had power and how they've used it so that they can use it in a different way in the future, in the present time.
Yeah, and the further removed from us in time these stories are, the less people feel defensive about them, right? So when I tell you that, your great grandma in 1920 was kind of, people don't get defensive about that. They're like, yeah, that rings true, right? But then if you're like, your neighborhood, your voting block is doing this, then it's like, well, wait a minute, right? I mean, I think the more removed you are from the situation, the easier it is to kind of accept that information.
Okay, there's a question. It seems that we have to change the systems from the bottom up. Question.
If you mean people have to change, my answer is, uh-huh.
Yeah, from the individual. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's why I like, look, if all I did today to change the world was like teach my kids to be better, it's okay. Like for today, it's okay, because that is the most important part. They have to be better than I am, or otherwise we're not going to get out of this.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because you're raising boys and girls of the future. So if they recognize that there's something better about them because of the color of their skin or because of what they have, then as adults, they'll hopefully be much more, equitable in just wanting to make sure that everybody has access to good things, and to also recognize the value of every human being. So yeah, it's important work, parenting.
There was a comment here about the institutions, and
yeah,
I just want to say, the institutions are built by the voters who elect the politicians to make the rules. And so institutions don't end up being, discriminatory without individuals individuals are the core of that system, right? And so there are some moments in American history where the institutions got like, they jumped ahead and did the right thing when people still weren't totally sure that they want to do the right thing. The Civil Rights Act is a great example of that, right? That eventually the politicians in the institution did the thing that Americans were still sort of resisting. And then as soon as they did it, Americans were like, all right, we're good. We're good with this. So, but that doesn't happen very often, right? Most of the time people lead the institutions. They say, this is what we want. And then they drag the institutions along with them. And so, I'm back to my point, which is like, the institutions are all good and fine, but they can't change if people don't demand that they change. That's how they're going to change for the most part. On occasion, you're going to get some really strong politician in Washington who changes an institution on their own without the American people behind them, but it's pretty rare. And so we're the problem. We have to be the solution.
Well, and I think
that's two more questions.
The voter suppression, though, really comes into play, and just making it difficult for people of color to be able to vote and to have access to all of that. That's intentional so that they don't vote, so that the powers that are in power can remain in power without any kind of change of the status quo.
Agreed.
Yeah, electoral college, we've got a lot of problems. So here's a question. What is the cost of oppression for white presenting people?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What is the cost?
Can I get a few more breadcrumbs?
What is the cost of oppression for white presenting people? So I don't know what the white presenting part, I mean, what is the cost to white people for this oppressive system?
Okay.
I mean,
now I do. Okay,
that's
so
kind of, go ahead.
So Bostic and Tankersley both say this better than I can, okay? But effectively, the message from both of them is it's not a zero-sum game. So, you know, the idea that like there's a group that can be more successful than they are currently doesn't mean that I will have to then be less successful than I am currently. That's true if you're trying to get into Harvard, okay? If we've got this idea that like, you know, Harvard has X number of spots, and so if you give them to that group, you're not going to give them to this group. Yes, agreed. Okay, but overall, this is not true. There's not some fixed pie in this country. There never has been, which is why it's the fastest growing developed country in the world, is that innovation rules the game, and that innovation is all about new avenues and new ways of contributing to the US economy. It always has been. And so Tankersley's book is all about how after World War II, we seem to embrace the idea that like we need to pull the maximum contribution from every American to make this economy grow. And we understood that. And then somewhere along the way, we stopped understanding that. And that's kind of that's the narrative he tells in that book. And then we've got to recenter ourselves to realize, right, that if you succeed, that means this overall pie is bigger. It doesn't mean that I lost something in that process. And we're, you know, from a, and this, Bostic would say this, like from a broader perspective, our growth rates have slowed down. Okay, so we've got an economy that's not as dynamic as it used to be. I mean, Europe is having its own set of struggles, so it's not likely to catch us anytime soon, but we're going to get caught by China. We're going to get caught by other Asian countries as we kind of slow down and they speed up. And so we ought to be thinking, all right, what's the best way to make this thing grow? I mean, somebody's going to have to pay for our retirement. Who's that going to be? You know, and so the way you get there, the way you get faster growth is, again, you extract the greatest amount of, you know, productivity and ingenuity and creativity from every American that you can extract. And we're clearly not doing that, right? We're leaving whole groups of people and just saying like, well, you're unlikely to be very, you know, worth anything in the economy, so we're just going to cut you out of this. So we're a long way from doing that. And if we could do it, we would all be in a better position.
Thank you. There's one more question. Adding to this,
are we at time, Kirsten? I think it's 8:30.
We were, this was planned for more than an hour, but yes, we can, I don't know, Professor Wanamaker, do you have time for this one last question, or?
I do.
Okay, thank you. Adding to this, is the better vote to the federal level or the state level to get these changes? Okay, is it better to get the changes? Do you need the federal level vote or the state level?
Well, it depends on your issue. I mean, there are weird, I live in a very red state, and there are weird issues that we're progressive on, like really weird things. We're the first state in the country to have free community college for every high school graduate. I don't know why, we just do, you know. Then we got other things where we're way behind. So it, you know, I would have been, if I was in the free community college lobby, I would have been more successful lobbying the governor than the president for whatever reason. There are other things where we're probably going to be more successful at the federal level, and that would include voting rights. Be my guess.
Yeah. So
when in doubt, do both.
Right. You need to
local.
be right. You need to be exercising your voting rights wherever you can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hit all the bases.
Exactly. Okay. So I don't want to keep. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. Really
thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And anybody who's participating wants to reach out separately, you can find me easily at UT. So.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you. You can follow us on Instagram, on Twitter, and on what else? The antiracistable.com. You can catch up.
Yep. Visit our website.
Our old conversations are all recorded, so you can, check them all out. And if you haven't joined our challenge or our community, sign up today. So thanks again. Enjoy your evening, everyone. And we'll see you next time at the Anti-Racist Table.
Yep. And thanks again to our wonderful guest.
Yes, of course.
Good night.
Good night.